Someone sent a video from it's about the Wisconsin teacher strikes from a social democratic perspective. You want to check that video out and
I would love
do a
to.
little
Yeah, let's do
reaction?
it. Let's do
Sweet.
it.
All right, I will pull it up here. What's this called? It's called How America's Best State Fell Apart, which is really true. Actually, I've gotten, before we start the video here, I'll say I had recently for my healthcare administration master's program, had to look at different states' unique Medicaid programs. And Wisconsin had one of the best Medicaid programs and some of the best healthcare results, just healthcare status and healthcare coverage for especially for low income people. And it was just dismantled by Walker, the same governor, Koch brothers funded Republican governor, who
Yeah,
busted
Scott
up
Walker's
teachers unions. What's that?
Scott Walker is quite a character.
Yeah, he's
It's
maybe
like
my least favorite person in the world who's ever
he's
lived.
he's like like if a communist cartoonist were to draw a libertarian, it'd be Scott Walker.
Yes,
It's like
literally.
every cartoon character asset that guy has. It's insane.
It is. Yeah, and he'll just like it drives my parents crazy that he's never been exposed, for all the lies he told, like, oh, things are going to get better for the teachers once we do this, or this is going to fix the debt, or what I do here with Medicaid is going to make Wisconsin's healthcare access so much better. And none of it is true. He's dismantled it for everyone. He's made everybody in Wisconsin's material conditions worse, and the media won't expose him for it, but people subconsciously know. But yeah, so let's check out this this video here. Let me know if y'all can't hear it for some reason.
Should I mute myself to let him?
Yeah, maybe you mute it. Yeah, and actually, let me reshare my screen one sec because I don't know that I turned the audio on. Okay, now I know it's on. Alrighty, let's do it.
Coalition that was so central to Wisconsin politics. So the governor adopted a strategy of divide and conquer. First, he sought to isolate the state's public sector unions, branding them as greedy and wasteful of taxpayer funds. He enacted a law outlawing collective bargaining for workplace safety, capping wage increases, and requiring recertification elections for the union every year. Within a few years, Wisconsin's public sector unions lost about 70% of their membership. And once he had hamstrung the public sector unions, he focused on private sector unions, signing a right-to-work bill that aimed to dramatically reduce union membership.
So that's interesting. I didn't even necessarily know that. I knew there was massive union busting in the 90s, but I wasn't even necessarily aware that he went and busted up more private sector unions after doing the public sector unions, which is interesting because, like I said, so many private sector workers who I talked to during this were talking about how the public sector workers were sitting too high on the hog and they were taking too much of the wealth, and that's what was taking away from the private sector. But really,
divide and conquer,
busting
like
divide and conquer, and then busting the public sector unions got the private sector unions busted.
70% less membership. That's insane. That's in that short of a time. It's so sad. Like, and it's so goddamn obvious. I'm sorry to swear. It's so goddamn obvious that that's what they're doing too. Capping wage increases. What kind of working class person is like, yeah, I want a limit on how much more I can get paid?
Right. Like, what working class person is going to support this? And
Right.
the media and Fox News had to do an all-out campaign in Wisconsin at this time in order to convince people of this
Unreal.
This nonsense.
Hey, you know what? I'll be right back. Give me 2 seconds. You didn't go ahead. I'll be right back.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just probably rant about this a little more. Yeah, and like, before we continue the video, one more thing. Going back to what we were saying about the deteriorating material conditions within capitalist countries are making life worse, making material conditions worse for a lot of people. which is moving more people towards socialism. We know this is how it works. Our material conditions, create our reality and people and classes and class interests. And before this happened, the majority of my family were Republicans, and they voted Republican every single year because they are Christian, and the church would tell them that that's what you have to do to be a good Christian. You know, there are a lot of people in my family who will never, ever, ever vote Republican again because of this. And some of them have become liberals. A lot of them have become socialists, and a lot of them have become at least social democrats because they watched this happen. As Noah said, it's so blatant what they were trying to do. It was so obvious how the political system screwed everyone in Wisconsin over. Every working class person in Wisconsin at the behest of the ruling class, the capitalist class. And even though these people were like lifelong Republicans, now they're being pushed to socialism because they're seeing how the system works firsthand. And which a viral video I made like a week ago, it pushed their kids to socialism now. Because even if my parents will never get a chance to change the system, I'm never gonna forget what I watched with my own eyes. When I was 13.
What was it? Khrushchev said, "Your children will be communists. You're welcome."
That's a good one. All right, let's. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, not a big fan of de-Stalinization, obviously, but Khrushchev had some zingers for sure.
He did. He's better than any capitalist imperialist leader. That's for sure.
Within a few years, Walker had cut Wisconsin's unionization rate nearly in half to roughly the same size as Alabama, a state with a long and violent anti-union history. In just 5 years, Walker had successfully hobbled the state's long tradition of labor power. Now, at the same time, the governor led a dramatic remaking of democracy in Wisconsin. Shortly after taking office, he approved a new electoral map of the state that divided districts to ensure large majorities for Republicans in every legislative election. Democratic voters were divided into a few districts where they would win overwhelmingly, and then a larger number of districts where they'd always lose.
It's interesting going back and looking at these sort of concepts or these concepts that you'll learn about in like a political science class that I learned about while getting my bachelor's in poli-sci or whatever. Because you learn about gerrymandering, right? And you talk about whether you think it's right and how to stop it and corruption. But now, knowing that capitalism always leads to a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and that the state is a tool of class suppression, and that the idea of democracy, liberal democracy under capitalism, is just a sham. It's so interesting to revisit these concepts like gerrymandering and being like, yeah, we just have an oligarchy. Like, we have an oligarchy where they have to do like sneaky covert things and work kind of hard to make sure that they can maintain the oligarchy, maintain their power via the ballot box. But they always will maintain their power via the ballot box. And it's largely, even gerrymandering is oftentimes just Republicans versus Democrats. It's just the two bourgeois parties trying to fight each other. And, there's not even there's no option at all for anything else. Yeah, it's just interesting. That's one of the main things that I learned from studying politics in the academy is you kind of get to see the ins and outs, like open the hood on the empire and see how the oligarchy really works and see how the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie really works.
It was one of the most effective gerrymanders in American political history. In 2018, for instance, Democrats won a majority of the statewide vote for state assembly, 53%, compared to 45% for Republicans. But Republicans still won about 2/3 of the state assembly seats. In order to have gained even a small majority in 2018, Democrats would have needed to win by about 20 points statewide.
And I want to stop this here because another point in relation to gerrymandering and the competition between Democrats and Republicans, these two bourgeois parties, I don't necessarily like this either because oftentimes the implication from arguments like this are like, the Republicans just cheated. The Republicans cheated the Democrats. And once we figure out how to get the Democrats in power, then everything will change. Wisconsin had a giant upset victory that put Tony Evers in power as the governor, this former school superintendent, Democrat. He's done nothing. He's done nothing except serve his donors. He's done nothing to rebuild the welfare state or the collective bargaining that existed before Walker. The Democrats are the same side of the other side of the same coin. And there's a good book that I bring up called Dark Money a lot by Jane Meyer, who's like a good liberal journalist as far as liberal journalists go, who investigated like the Koch brothers and how they fund the academy and how they infiltrate education and how they do media propaganda. But basically, the argument is like the right wing, the Republicans have co-opted the country. And once we get liberals or progressives in power, everything will be better. It's like, no, the liberals and progressives have done the same thing, just with, different donors, or sometimes the same exact donors as the Republicans.
I actually read that book on your recommendation.
Oh, really? What'd you think of it?
I really enjoyed it. It was good. I especially like she went and read all of these letters, right? Mm-hmm. That's crazy to me. Actually went there, went to George Mason and these other like homes of libertarian thought. That's only what's the word I'm looking for? Proliferated because of this dark money she's talking about. It was really good though. I liked the book a lot. But I think that is important to bring up, that this is both of these bourgeois parties doing this. This is the way their system works, is by exposing, the Republican Party in this instance. It makes it look as if the Democrats are going to do something if they get in power, right? And it's just not really proven out in the data. In my city, Cleveland, Democrats have run this city forever, and it's the poorest big city in the entire country, right? It's literally falling apart. So
But basically what they do is point to the corruption, the things that both parties do to maintain the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and then just say, oh, Republicans are gerrymandering, isn't that bad? And it's like, oh, Democrats aren't. Obama, his whole rise to political prominence would have been impossible without gerrymandering. He would have lost, his first major election win in Illinois if it wasn't for the gerrymandering of the districts. It's both of these parties, and the media will be sneaky and point out the corruption of one, but it's both of them.
What I also think is important to think about on this subject is think about why gerrymandering is done. Certain communities tend to be socially one or the other, right? There's strongholds for the Republicans or the Democrats. And the vast majority of working class people don't even vote, right? We either can't or are prevented from it in some way, or most of the time it's that we're so jaded, we don't see either party doing a damn thing for us, so we just don't vote. But anyway, so we have all this collected data on voting habits. Some communities are liberal, some are conservative. Metropolitan areas tend to be liberal, rural areas tend to be conservative. And we still have this old system of drawing and redrawing districts, and it's done to get one organization or another in power, right? It's not for the democratic will of the people. Like, none of our politicians are in any way interested in that. But it shows that this way of sort of separating it into districts and stuff like that may not be the best way to really figure things out for different areas. And as the working class comes into power, we're going to need to grapple with this question of, well, how do we fulfill the will of the majority, right?
Yes.
And where does it constitute itself? How is that set up? Should the people in Kansas be deciding things for the people in New York City? Or how do we get together and decide all of those? There's a lot of very concrete questions that the bourgeoisie can ignore because they're not actually interested in the will of the people, that we're just not going to be able to.
Yeah, and I think it actually probably increases the political polarization between rural and urban areas and these different sectors of the working class who get, gerrymandered into different districts, and then they view their enemy as the Democrats over in the next district. Or, there are a lot of states in the Midwest who are mostly red outside of whatever districts have colleges, but there are huge populations of people there, so it can flip the state blue. And then the enemy of the rural working class becomes the urban proletariat or the college students or whoever's voting for those darn Democrats, when both it's in the interest of all the masses to turn their attention towards the bourgeoisie in both parties.
Yeah, it's like one of the things Stalin was really good at doing is working towards a resolution of this contradiction between city and country, right? What my dad used to call walking the Stalin line between those two extremes, and also at the same time between ultra leftism and right opportunism. All of these things have a Stalin line between them.
Absolutely. I like that way of putting it.
65% of the vote, an almost impossible feat. With an essentially permanent majority, Republicans are empowered in Wisconsin's government basically no matter what happens in any election. And when a Democratic governor won office in 2018, the Republican legislature executed an 11th hour power grab that stripped him of many of his powers.
Okay, to be fair, because the recall election in Wisconsin did come from the grassroots. It was being demanded by the masses, and there were mass protests outside of the Capitol demanding a recall. But the Democrats were just taking advantage of that sentiment to try and get Walker out of power so they could take power. And they had a recall election to try and strip him of his powers. And yeah, it was Democratic, but even me as the most anti-Walker person who knows that recall election, did have grassroots support, the Democrats still try to do the same thing. They try to strip him of his powers. It's not like this is unique to the Republicans. But
it's all very cynical, real politicking.
Yes.
And strengthen their own. Because Wisconsin doesn't have a system of direct democracy, there's practically nothing that can be done about any of this. Wisconsin today is a very different place than the Wisconsin of 100 years ago. The egalitarian worldview of Wisconsin progressives and socialists is gone. The institutions that allowed that world to flourish, the factories and labor unions, the thriving towns and cities, the basic sense of community and solidarity have disintegrated. And the democracy that was once at the heart of the Wisconsin idea has become a farce, where every election returns the same party to power.
Do you know what the Wisconsin idea is, Eddie?
I do not. I was actually wondering that. I know they have a long history of unions. During the protests, there were a lot of people holding up signs that said, unions are Wisconsin's history. Unions are what made Wisconsin great.
It's true.
Yeah, it is true. Yeah, I don't know what the Wisconsin idea is specifically, though. Googling it.
I one time met a celebrity in Wisconsin, and I
really?
remember this. Yeah, in Milwaukee, I was on tour there, and I was at a party after I played a show, and Mitch Hedberg showed up at the house I was at in order to buy drugs off of one of the people at the party.
That's a nice anecdote about Wisconsin.
Yeah, the rest of my time in Wisconsin was great. I wasn't living a great life at the time.
We've all been there. Well, some of us. The Wisconsin idea is basically what I said. It's a public philosophy, meaning we're just going to have strong collective bargaining. We're going to have strong public education system, healthcare system. Like I said, not only was Wisconsin's collective bargaining and their public sector unions dismantled, but the Medicaid system was dismantled by Walker. He actually used Obamacare, the ACA, as a platform to rip healthcare out of people's hands, which people think Obamacare is a left-wing healthcare proposal, but in Wisconsin, it led to less healthcare access and more expensive healthcare, actually, because the system that we had previously was better than the ACA,
Really?
and even better than the current form of Medicaid, which ACA improved in many states. But yeah, so I guess that's the Wisconsin idea. Now I know a little bit more about the state where I grew up.
Yeah, Obamacare was
sorry.
actually written by Mitt Romney mostly, wasn't it? It was a Heritage Foundation paper.
Yep.
Very, very crazy.
Yeah, it was called Romney Care, I think, even.
Yeah.
And sorry, one last thing, but like I've had to look really in depth at the healthcare system, studying healthcare administration for this master's program, and it is you can, when you look at the ins and outs of Obamacare and read all the studies done on it, it's absolutely a right-wing healthcare policy, and people
for
just
sure.
don't really understand how insurance works, I think, because it's needlessly complicated, so because they don't want you to understand it so they can rob you. Not because people are
100%.
dumb. Right.
They needlessly complicate sort of pop economics too. All
Yes.
of the sort of like Krugner and that, or Krugman and people like that, they just use a ton of jargon, overcomplicate things, so people don't learn about it.
It's what the Frankfurt School does with Marxism.
Wisconsinites is that policies that are popular with the vast majority of Wisconsin voters, like legalizing recreational marijuana, raising the minimum wage, and expanding Medicaid, have no shot of becoming law. In other words, Wisconsinites don't really live in a representative democracy. But this isn't just a story about Wisconsin. It's also part of a global story.
I was going to say, where in the U.S. is there representative democracy? I feel like Wisconsin, because of their collective bargaining and public welfare systems, had maybe closer to direct democracy than the rest of the country, but nobody has democracy. America's never been a democracy.
And even if we're talking democracy, direct democracy is that's quite a thing, like
Yeah.
everyone directly voting for things in a country of 345 million people. I don't know.
I don't know
I
that we
want
want
representatives,
that.
right? Like I
I
want
want some production decisions taken care of by the state, so I don't got to think about them.
Exactly. I really don't want to know the ins and outs of water legislation, I just
Right.
want my water to come into my house.
Yeah, 100%. That's dictatorship, though. If the government builds, irrigation or plumbing and brings water to hundreds of thousands of new people without them directly voting for it, that's dictatorship.
Oh yeah, then Stalin will take the water away and cause a famine, and yeah, that's horrible. You don't want that.
He gives it to him just to take it away. Classic Stalin move.
That he likes to tease. That's his thing.
The same story that's played out all across the West, in the north of France, in the east of Germany, or in northern England. It's a story of loss, not just the loss of jobs and the dissolution of communities, but of the loss of possibility, of hope, the loss of the bright futures once offered by the mass politics of working people. All we're left with is a dreary present. And there's no better symbol of that than Wisconsin, a state that, though always imperfect, once represented equality, solidarity, and democracy, has become a symbol of a new type of society. We traded away those time-tested ideals and in turn got a society that was far more oligarchic, more atomized, and more adrift than the one that had come before.
It's interesting to hear him say this because we were talking about how deteriorating material conditions have pushed so many people into socialism in the left, and it is a global thing, as he's saying. It's something we've seen in Europe and all the wealthy capitalist countries, and Canada and other North American countries. But it's interesting to hear him say Wisconsin's a symbol of that. It's like just for me, growing up in Wisconsin and being pushed to socialism by all this stuff that he's talking about. It's like, yeah, absolutely. It is a symbol of how all the welfare state and collective bargaining has been dismantled.
100%. It definitely is, and it drives me crazy when we're constantly gaslit about how good we have it, right?
Right.
Like when Trump was in office, him talking about how good the stock market's doing means how good we're all doing, or like ultra lefts, like, oh, Americans are all living high on the hog with their their cell phones and refrigeration and, you know,
Right.
ridiculous.
And the only thing I have to that I disagree with a little bit about what he said in that last segment. He says all we have is the dreary present. It's like, no, we have the future. You know, we have construction in the future. We can look at the failures of the past, see how capitalism inevitably leads to accumulation and inequality and the dismantling of class struggle, welfare systems that workers have fought for, collective bargaining that workers have organized themselves into and fought for. You know, we can see how the capitalists and their oligarchic state have dismantled these things and take power of the state and build a new system of construction. Like, that is the future that we have to look to. We can't just hang our heads on the dreary present and you know, talk about, just spend all day talking about how shitty everything is, which is what I see, I think, a lot of people doing sometimes. Which I get it.
I mean, it can be hard not to focus on how terrible it's getting, you know, and sometimes it can be hard to see that our struggle necessitates a better future. Especially when you have sort of the Scott Walker types and the Libertarian Party, for example, doing things like advocating child labor again, you know,
Right.
who not only want to focus on the dreary present, but an even drearier past.
Yeah.
I have a 12-year-old son. I don't want him working in the mines, you know, so he learns the value of labor. That's insane.
That is insanity. Your son needs to lose a finger to learn the value of labor.
You know what's funny? My grandma, so my dad, when he was actually a union officer at a GM plant for a long, long time. And my grandma worked at the same plant too. And she lost a finger in the machine, right?
Oh, wow.
And we used to joke all the time, like anytime someone got out of line at work or whatever, like telling someone in the family about it, like the joke was, oh, you know how grandma was missing that finger? The implication was that we take a finger for organizing or getting out of line or whatever.
Man, that's about as proletarian of a story as you can get.
It's even better when you know that my grandparents were from the Soviet Union.
All right.
And in that bargain, we're all worse off. I'm Philip Rocco, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University for the Gravel Institute.
Yeah, thank you to whoever sent that. That was absolutely fascinating for me to watch. I think for all of us to watch. But I really appreciate that as someone who, you know, lived that, grew up in that, and had that push me to socialism. And yeah, it's a social democratic thing, like you said. So I have my critiques of it, as we made there. But I mean, it laid out pretty well, you know, the changes in economic conditions and how it was enacted and how the government went about doing this, or the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie went about dismantling these workers' protections and these organs of class struggle. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, I'm not usually a big fan of the Gravel Institute, but some of their videos, like that one,